You are the wife of a Roman senator. The day begins quietly. Your husband is speaking at the forum. The children are studying with their tutors in the garden. The scent of the supper you're planning hangs in the air. Everything feels ordinary until imperial guards appear at your door. They haven't come with a warrant. No crime has been committed. Their presence means something else entirely. They are here because the Empress herself has demanded your service. You do not yet know that this evening will break your marriage, stain your family's name, and turn you into the plaything of the most powerful woman in the world of that time. For her, it is just another Tuesday night. For you, it is the beginning of a nightmare. This is where the story of Valeria Messalina begins. Young, dazzling, standing beside Claudius, a woman who for 7 years co-ruled an empire of more than 60 million souls. The histories remember her as the wife who gave Roman air and steadied the state after Caligula's murder. But behind marble columns and gilded ceremony, something far darker took root. Something you won't find in school books. Chroniclers of the era, even those hardened to slavery and violence, struggled to capture what unfolded behind the locked doors of the imperial palace. Messalina was not merely a bored libertine drunk on power. She built what today would be called a machinery of psychological domination, a carefully engineered network of entertainments for the elite, where life and dignity were tallied like entries in a ledger. What you are about to hear is not legend. 2,000 years of surviving sources, court records, bureaucratic letters, the accounts of Tacitus and Pliny, paint a picture of crimes rooted in the heart of the empire. For nearly a decade in the center of Rome, a deliberate system of humiliation targeted not nameless slaves, but the wives and daughters of its most powerful families. Messalina turned their bodies into instruments of political control. Imagine your quiet life in a villa. One day, imperial envoys arrive at your gate with a so-called recruitment letter. It is no accident. They know everything: your husband's patrons, how he earned his office, his standing in the Senate. They hold your family's file and know whether you can refuse. It lists your appearance, lineage, even your temperament, meant to predict who will yield to pressure and who might resist. The moment you are chosen, the performance begins. They tell you it is an exceptional honor. The Empress herself has recognized your loyalty to Rome. Refusal? It would be dangerous, not only for you, but for your husband's career, your children's future, your house's standing. The imperial palace, the empire's very heart, was remade into a hidden brothel, not for the rabble, not for enslaved women, but for high-born ladies, wives of senators, daughters of consuls, Rome's elite. What was labeled honor became a weapon. Cross the threshold, and everything that made you yourself is stripped away: your name, your status, your privacy. Only one title remains: an imperial asset. These women were supplied to wealthy merchants, generals, foreign envoys, and ambitious politicians. They paid obscene sums precisely because they slept with a senator's wife. Behind the curtain, Messalina kept ledgers, set schedules, tracked revenue. This was no chaos. It was a system, organized and audited. In time, the palace became an arena. Messalina inaugurated a new kind of spectacle, contests where aristocratic women were pitted against professional prostitutes. Pliny the Elder preserves the most infamous episode. The Empress challenged the celebrated courtesan Sylla to see who could take more partners in a single day. After 25 encounters, Messalina prevailed. 25 in one day, before spectators who applauded, as if at a gladiatorial match. Where once men debated the fate of the state, crowds now watched women's humiliation for sport. Yet the keenest blade was how exploitation hardened into policy. The Empress treated her women like diplomatic gifts. Kings and governors visiting Rome were granted access to noble ladies as a sign of imperial favor. But the smile hid a snare. Every act, every night was recorded, an archive for future blackmail. You slept with a senator's wife? Now you belong to us. Thus the web spread far beyond the capital. Provincial governors copied the model, creating local versions of the palace harem. The empire was laced with a structure that made sexual humiliation part of administrative order. Worst of all was not the violation of bodies, but the unmaking of identity. One day you are a mother, a wife, a woman with a name. The next, a number in a registry. Roman law deepened the tragedy. Husbands could not reclaim their honor once their wives were defiled, even at imperial command. Families fractured, children inherited shame. Girls grew up knowing their bodies might be called to serve the state. Boys learned that submission to power was the only path to survive. Some women ended their lives when their service ended. Others faded from sight, faces hidden from the world. And Messalina? She grew still stronger, ringed with wealth and flattery. You may wonder, how could this endure so long in full view of Rome? This is only the beginning of her story. Messalina's power did not shout, it calculated. It ran on cold planning, bureaucratic drill, and a carefully tended language of appearances that rebranded violence as merit and blackmail as proof of loyalty to the state. In that vocabulary, humiliation became a duty, and silence the price entire families paid to survive in the shadow of the Palatine. This is how a regime grows that looks like administration, yet works like a machine grinding down human dignity. Over everything loomed the threat of public spectacle, because Messalina could turn suffering into entertainment and entertainment into political currency. In time, viewing galleries emerged inside the palace, where invited notables observed precision-staged contests and endurance trials, grotesquely likened to gladiatorial bouts. The loudest echo is the tale recorded by Pliny the Elder, a contest between the Empress and a famed courtesan to see who could take more partners in a single day, ending with Messalina's victory after 25 encounters. It was no mere whisper of gossip, but a motif that runs through sources and later readings, still raising questions about credibility, and about how far this theater of power truly went. At the core of her dominance lay an archive, registers of names, tastes, debts, favors, and fears, raw material for weaving invisible webs of dependency. Every provincial guest, every envoy from a foreign court could be bound by a single gesture of favor and a single report filed in the palace's secret cabinets. A liaison with a Roman matron became the thread by which to pull an entire web, because once recorded, an event did not vanish. It returned at the most opportune moment, to force a vote, extract a concession, seize an estate, or crush an ambition. Privacy became an extension of power. Diplomacy, a cold craft of orchestrated compromise. If someone slipped the net, other methods surfaced, those that reveal the court of Claudius at its truest, susceptible to omens and steered by the whispers of those nearest the bedchamber. Recall the fall of Appius Silanus, a staged mourning, a sudden alarm about a sinister dream, and then a surprising coincidence: the Empress claimed to see the same vision on subsequent nights. When the target appeared at the appointed hour, the prophecy was confirmed, and a verdict swiftly followed, which the emperor next day presented to the Senate as vigilance by those closest to him. In such a palace, a dream could become evidence, a suggestion hard fact. This was no isolated episode. Many accusations, trials, and confiscations exploited a human urge to find signs where there is only fear and prompting. Entangled in such narratives, the emperor could, with a nod, shatter a man's career, life, and fortune, while those whispering in his ear set the stage so that everything looked like historical necessity. Messalina did not need to raise her voice. She arranged actors and props, a secretary, the guard, a terrified petitioner, and a chance coincidence at dawn. Where dreams and omens failed, the law served private appetites. The most notorious case was that of Valerius Asiaticus, owner of the coveted Gardens of Lucullus. Sources describe a palace trial conducted not under the Senate's majesty, but in the imperial bedchamber, with Messalina pulling strings from the side until the sentence opened the way to seize the prized estate. Tacitus and others preserve how far intimacy, politics, and property could merge when power no longer recognized the boundary between private whim and public decree. Confiscations after treason verdicts paid twice, an enemy removed, a treasury enriched, especially for those on the right side. Over the years, property shifted hands in the quiet of palace corridors, and their new masters owed fortunes less to prudent investments than to fluency in the arts of court intrigue. Here, political calculus and plain greed fused into a single conveyor belt of wealth, driven by rumor elevated to the rank of edict. Meanwhile, the empire learned this new grammar of power. Governors in the provinces, impressed by the palace machine, copied its parts. Discreet registers, hospitality salons veined with coercion, channels of influence built on shame and the need for silence. Thus a capital invention became general practice, folded into administrative rhythm. Forms, inspections, decrees that sounded dry yet reached into the most intimate parts of life. The deepest wound does not bleed at once. It becomes a scar carried by families for generations. Children stripped of a language to speak of their mothers. Young men whose advancement required complicity in someone else's silence. Girls who learned too early that a body could be summoned like paperwork. This quiet mechanism endures because it needs no guards, only shame, which polices itself and holds the order more firmly than soldiers at a gate. It is tempting to settle for easy labels, condemnation, sensation, moral outrage. Yet ancient testimony invites another reading, a study of how institutions, language, and daily habits turn exceptions into norms. That is what makes Messalina's story difficult and current. It is not about one person alone, but about a system that lets evil go unnoticed because it is convenient, profitable, and dressed in ceremony. From such a system grows the confidence that hastens ruin. The shadow of pride lengthens with every seized garden, every choreographed acquittal, every act of rebranding violence as honor. When boundaries burst under the pressure of impunity, when the court becomes a stage where no role needs hiding, the moment arrives when the spectacle betrays itself. Our story moves inexorably toward that moment. Everything began to fracture the moment pride outgrew the palace walls. When the emperor left the city, Messalina did the unthinkable. She staged a public wedding to her lover, Gaius Silius, with full ceremony, witnesses, and fanfare, as if she were a free woman, not the wife of Rome's ruler. For her, it was a show of strength and untouchability. For everyone else, a signal that the game would now be played without masks or euphemisms. The wedding became a carnival of cruelty. The victims of her system were made to entertain the guests, as if one evening could sum up years of humiliation and seal them as the new normal. The news reached the emperor quickly, but it was not his hand that moved first. The palace faction understood that only an immediate blow could save their positions. Before Messalina could undo a single knot, armed men were sent to cut short the performance and end it with a brutal finale. Neither pleas nor private appeals nor old networks of influence availed her. On that day, the finely tuned theater of suggestion, ledgers, and whispers collided with the blunt logic of power, which sensed that the balance had finally tipped from reward to risk. Her final hours played out in the Gardens of Lucullus, a symbolic stage seized earlier through palace intrigue and confiscation. There, away from the crowd but under the eyes of the emperor's loyal men, Messalina was driven to a choice Romans considered a last vestige of honor. She was to take her own life. She could not. When her hand faltered on the blade, another finished the task, without ceremony, without witnesses who might feed the city with a fresh round of rumor. The fate of the woman who had choreographed others' disgrace for years was sealed in silence. Court life resumed its usual rhythm with unnerving speed. Councils spoke of order, necessity, and proportionate punishment, as if the matter were not a person but a faulty part to be replaced. Soon after, Messalina's memory was formally erased, her name condemned to oblivion, her images removed, her papers arranged so that only a convenient trace remained. The ritual was as old as Rome, and as effective as the victors required. For her children and kin, a new era opened, fresh arrangements, political marriages, accelerated decisions about succession. On the horizon, an heir from a different branch came into view, and the promises of yesterday found new recipients. Such is power once the wheel of fortune gathers speed. What seemed obvious yesterday becomes today's embarrassment and tomorrow's marginal note. Compassion has no place in the protocol. If there is a lesson here, it resists an easy moral. This is a story about how language can dress violence as honor, how bureaucracy can turn shame into paperwork, and paperwork into chains of dependency that bind a city and its provinces. First comes the euphemism, then the form, and at last the custom, and suddenly no one asks why, but under which paragraph. In that sense, Messalina was not a lone monster, but a creation of an age that perfected the art of naming things as something other than what they were. And there remains the memory of those whose names never made it onto stone tablets: wives, daughters, mothers, women who overnight became assets and proofs of loyalty. Their fates rarely entered the annals or courtroom speeches because shame keeps its silence better than the strictest censor. Yet the strength of that regime stood on their backs, on fear of exclusion, on the habit of silence, on the belief that against an empire, private life has no worth. Could something like this return in another form? Look not to purple and palaces, but to mechanisms. Wherever shame becomes an instrument of politics, archives are wielded as weapons, and public spectacle hides private harm, the same warning light begins to flash. Fashions and languages change, the logic does not. First normalize, then formalize, then call it ordinary. And Rome? Rome endured, as it always did, by absorbing its own disgraces into fresh narratives. Old gardens became stages for new triumphs, palaces filled with different whispers and newer promises. Yet one echo does not fade, the echo of names no one wished to remember, and stories no one chose to write down. If this tale offers any hope, it is that even after many centuries, we can still call things by their names and return a voice to those from whom it was taken.